This
Record that.
conference
That's
will
okay.
now be recorded.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got a very special presentation today, and this is furthering the government's federal framework to reduce recidivism that we're very interested in pursuing. And we have been very fortunate that Iridian Grenada, who is still in his first week of having left the prison gates and in a halfway house, has done some research for us based on his own research and his own personal experience on whether there are elements of Nordic systems that work pretty well in reducing recidivism that could be used or applied in Canada. So I think it's a very interesting subject, and I hope we get a lot out of it. Iridian, welcome.
Yes, welcome, and nice to be with the group this morning. It was only 3 days ago that this black box that you now call a telephone was sitting on the desk and vibrating, and I was slapping it to try and make it talk. But so that works back in the cell block. It doesn't work on the little black box. Anyhow, so just a little bit of a background for the group this morning. I was just released to a halfway house on the 8th, and today being the 15th, so not that long ago. And that was after 29 years, 300 and about 46 days of incarceration. So nothing too crazy. And I went directly from my circumstance took me directly from a medium security, a kind of a high medium security here in Abbotsford, to a halfway house that is one of formerly affiliated with John Howard Society and is kind of working with a little bit with a new organization. But the whole framework is a JHS framework. It's called Elliott House in Abbotsford, British Columbia. Really nice group of people, all trained by JHS. So why wouldn't they be a nice group of people? So that's a little bit about my background. Catherine and I have known each other for probably 6 to 7 years. I came into her sphere of influence when she was working with JHS to provide some context and some information for the closure of Kingston Penitentiary. And so she reached out to me and asked if maybe I could provide some writing or facilitate some artwork that we could use for the tour on Kingston. And it has been a very instructive on my part relationship moving forward, but a very wonderful relationship too, to be able to come into the John Howard sphere of influence, and we'll just call it the John Howard family. So when she reached out to me last July-ish and asked me if I would have the capacity to be able to formulate a report that would do a comparison between Norway and Canada in terms of our correctional systems, I felt that I had a lot of knowledge and information on the subject. I'd previously worked as an advocate and a writer inside. I wrote a column for the province newspaper for a few years. That led me down a lot of channels of research. I've also got a wonderful relationship with a law professor that some or many of you may know by the name of Michael Jackson, who has been a long time prisoner advocate and reformation advocate for incarceration. And so I had the mental capacity. What I didn't have is I didn't have the online capacity. And as I have recently learned, if you don't know how to use a cell phone or the internet or Google, you better have an amazing partner to work with in the community. I do. My wife and I work together pretty effectively, and whenever Canada Post can get stuff to us, we do well. So that's how the report came into its current state. And so what I did is I took a look at some of the material that is publicly available on Norwegian corrections, and I found out that they're very proud. They're very proud of their correctional system in Norway. They actively invite media partners into their correctional system from all over the world. They've got a prison over there that's kind of widely described or arguably described as the Hilton of maximum security prisons across the globe. It's called Halden Prison. And we came into some information and some interview information with the governor, which is the fancy name for the warden of Halden Prison. His name was Ari Hoydel. And working from there, we were able to make some contacts with folks inside of the Norwegian probation service, which is their equivalent of parole. And we were able to get a lot of our questions answered, and those things sort of made their way into the report. It was very interesting because I had met, just trying to think of his name, from Denmark before he had formerly been our commissioner. It's slipping my
Ole
brain here.
Engström?
Yeah, Ole. Yeah. So I had met Ole back in 1991. He had come to a minimum security facility called Elbow Lake at that time. It's since been transferred over to the Indigenous Corrections portfolio. It's a healing camp now. But he came up there, really interesting guy. First time I ever met anybody that was a highfalutin. And he came up and sat while I was working with a fellow working on learning how to carve a totem pole. That's kind of my family background, Algonquin. And he was just a very easy, he was a Catherine Latimer for CSC at that time. He'd just sit down with you and talk with you and how you doing and what's going on for you guys. So when I also recognized that Mr. Engstrup had been instrumental in the CSC mission statement from back in the early 90s, and that he had played a role in the CCRA and the development of that. So when I started looking at Norwegian corrections, I actually said, wait a second, this is not Norwegian corrections, this is Canadian corrections. I'm probably the only prisoner in captivity, maybe I can count on one hand if there's any others, who has read the entire correctional law review, which is the 900-page body of work on how we got to the CCRA. And so I felt quite informed to be able to see the Norwegian model and say, wait a second, this is not the Norwegian model, this is the Canadian model, with heated sidewalks in Oslo because they've got a $1.3 trillion sovereign wealth fund, right? But it was the thinking and the patterns of the CCRA and the rationale behind even Section 3B about reintegration and losing the word reintegration and reformation. Let's call it reformation of prisoners. Yeah, I don't want to say they copied us, but if they copied us, they copied great stuff, because we did 8 or 9 years of review and we went around the world and talked to a lot of international partners. Canada did in the development of the CCRA. And they took it home and they turned it into kind of a Nordic model, which was based upon their society, which is a strong social society, not socialist, but a very socially dynamic society, smaller. And so it was really easy to draw the parallels between Norwegian corrections and Canadian corrections. There were some differences, though. And one of the differences had very much to do with Norwegian corrections' relationship with media. And they had invited people in from Britain, from BBC News. They'd invited writers in from Australia. They'd invited a film crew in from the United States right into their prisons. And it didn't look canned. It didn't sound canned. The writers were very forthcoming in the fact that basically, especially in Halden, the maximum security penitentiary, they were just told, go talk to people. And people talked to them. And I thought, that's something that's missing in the Canadian prison environment. The last time, I can't remember the last time because I don't think it's ever existed, that the CBC walked down the hallways of Kent Institution or Millhaven Institution. I think there was something in 1964 in Joyceville in black and white. I saw it on CBC one night, and I've never seen anything since. And it was kind of funny watching it on an old CBC clip, because as I was sitting there listening to the prisoners talk to the media about what their experience was, it sounded, if I closed my eyes, I was in an inmate committee meeting in Millhaven. That's what it was. The food, I can't get enough medication, but it was really, it wasn't canned, it was forthcoming, and there was nobody standing over top of the prisoner saying, muting them. There was no mute button on it, right? I think that that's important in relation to the federal framework to reduce recidivism, because one of the big ticket items that the minister put in his message right at the beginning was a need for the Canadian public to understand what reformation and reintegration is. And darling, what's the word I'm thinking? It's not reformation. When I'm talking to darling, I'm talking to my wife. Rehabilitation. There we go. I'm so averse to that word because it's such a, nobody knows what it means, but everybody understands what reformation means. To reform yourself, right? To be reformed into something new. So reformation and reintegration, the minister understands that in order to have those two things happen, it's a teamwork. It's, this is JHS's philosophy. That's why they reached inside and started talking to me and asking me about, what do you guys think? Like, what's going on for you guys in there? And because let's face it, the elephant in the room is that committing crime, reducing recidivism. So recidivism happens by guys that are getting out of the penitentiary and go do crime. So shouldn't we go talk to the guys who are in the penitentiary and ask them, hey, what would it take for you to stop doing crime? Like, how can we help you with this? And there's not a lot of that going on. And John Howard Society really took the lead. Catherine took the lead in this. So if we could promote the idea, or even start to use some of our media partnerships to talk to people about, folks in the media, about soliciting CSC and going in. Why is there not a CBC camera sitting in a classroom full of prisoners who are taking a restoration program, right? A correctional program, so that the public can see what that is. And I think that seems to be happening much more effectively in Norway than it is in Canada. So that was one of the recommendations I made in the report, is that CSC take a really self-reflective look on how how decreasing their barriers to media participation could help them to better fulfill their mandate under Section 3B of the CCRA. And that's that component about reformation and reintegration. Did you have any questions? I'm getting a little bit wordy here, Catherine.
I have a comment, and that is, I think every time there is some sort of a profile made of a prisoner, and the person comes into the public realm, the community starts to see them as a human being that may have done something, unacceptable, but there's that human connection, and that's what we need, I think, in order to support the rehabilitation and reintegration of prisoners. So I think the media can play a significant role. I think it allows them to see the dignity and the humanity of these individual people, rather than seeing them as the beast that needs to be locked up behind bars. And that helps, changes perceptions and psyche.
CSC's kind of, you're 100% correct. I mean, what are we talking about? Prisoners. We're not talking about prisoners. We're talking about people, right?
Yeah.
Catherine and I were in a meeting together with a group the other day, the board of directors for JHS. And we had the privilege of having with us a correctional manager from CSC, who's very, very, very up to date on the Indigenous portfolio, and works a lot with Indigenous guys in the institution. So it was super, super positive for us to have her there. After the conversation, after the meeting, we sat down, and she was so excited to be involved in something that implemented CSC and inmates, prisoners, and community justice partners. She really loved that triangle. And then she said, I said to my mate, prisoners are people too. And I said, no, I won't mention her name here because I don't have permission to do so. But I said to her, no, prisoners are people, period, not two, right? And so, of course, the public has no idea about that. Come on. I mean, they just
Yeah.
see the 10-minute blurb on global news or some other sort of sensational thing. And that's all they get, right? So this kind of thing that we're doing right now, one of the things that I'd said to Catherine was, and I'm not an outlier. There are other people who can speak, and I'm getting used to the technology, but now I feel like I'm sitting talking to Catherine, which is much more comfortable and a very familiar conversation that we have. But can the media be trained to do that kind of stuff too? We spend almost $3 billion per year in Canada, which is a huge financial footprint for such a small demographic of people. I think we spend more as taxpayers than Norway does, and we don't have a $1.3 trillion sovereign wealth fund. But for what Canadians are paying for, shouldn't they have access to prisoners? I mean, even this kind of thing. I got some kind of a button on the computer that says chat. So now, why couldn't they take questions? Now we have the component having to do with victims. Hello, everybody knows that. We're very experienced and we're maturing all the time as a nation in terms of how to have relationships. I've been practicing restorative justice for over 20 years myself, and there are other men inside who are actively interested in that because part of rehabilitation is redemption. And they really, redemption is the crack cocaine for prisoners. They want to redeem themselves. They really do. But how do they do that without access to relationships? So media can play a role in that. And I think, I make a recommendation to that in the report that CSC take a look at its current, very kind of locked down and difficult policy to navigate in terms of making media more available. I think that John Howard Society, and I think that I can play a role in that. But there are other prisoners who can speak and who are in halfway houses. And then there are prisoners inside who can speak for themselves. And they should be heard. They really should, especially Indigenous prisoners, because everybody's talking about, well, why is Indigenous overrepresentation so high? There are so few, Joey twins maybe, and so few others who are actually being asked, what do you think about that? Why is Indigenous overrepresentation so high? How come, when I started writing for the province a few years ago, how I was able to sell them on this being a good idea is that the Harper government had come into power and they had made prisons and incarceration and safe streets a big part of their platform. And they were talking to politicians and criminologists, and nobody was talking to prisoners. And if we're the ones doing the crime, shouldn't, are we not in that conversation somehow? So I said, everybody's talking about us and nobody's talking to us. And, and I sold my column as a kind of an inside shot at 800 words a week from the Ultimate Insider. And I think that people got to see that prison was mundane and banal and funny and ridiculous, as it would be when you lock up 300 people, each in their own individual bathroom, which is what I call a concrete room with a toilet in it, and I don't know what else to call it. So that takes care of the sort of media part of it. That was the recommendation. The other recommendation. Yeah, go
I
ahead,
just want
please.
to raise one point, Iridian, and that is,
Yeah.
I was reading this book, the life sentences of Rick McQuinney or something, and he debated. This is a long time ago, back in the 60s or early 70s. He debated, and CBC went in the abolition of the death penalty, and
Right.
what the author and everybody was saying is that his points sort of got lost because everybody wanted to talk about what he had done. So his past and the past crime kind of overshadowed where he was at that moment and what his opinions were. I mean, I think John Howard and others can play a significant role in kind of saying, like, yes, accountability has been delivered on that front, and this is what we have now. This is the contributing citizen. This is the person who wants to make good. Like, it's hard for the media to extract itself from the sensationalism of the original offense.
That's human beings. We love a good story, right? Show, don't tell. I mean, the report that I wrote is different than I believe, and I stand to be corrected, but it's in a different kind of voice than John Howard has written before. John Howard has a
That's true.
very,
That's true.
yeah, it's John Howard has a very strong reputation, and is on solid ground academically, has tremendous respect in committees and so forth in policymaking centers. But sometimes you have to get down in the dirt. I mean, if we're going to ask the Canadian public, and this is one of the comments that I make in my report, we're going to ask the Canadian public to buy into catch and release corrections, criminal justice. They don't get it. They come like, why are these guys getting out of jail ever? Is their number one question. Because they watch cop dramas in the States, and in 45 minutes, you either catch or kill the guy, and they never see him again. He doesn't show up back. You know, what you don't see at the end of the trailer there is that the guy's actually going through the process and is already on his way out to the community, depending on the time frame, at the end of the show. But nobody ever sees that, right? So people think, well, that guy never, why is that guy ever getting out? Because it's your criminal justice system that you built and voted on over 165 years, and you want him out. It's your law. And people go, I don't remember doing that, right? So, but how do you say that to the public in a non-condescending way? Because here I am, I'm appearing before you today, not only as a man who's been in prison for 30 years, but I wasn't there for jaywalking, right? I have a murder conviction, was numerous bank robberies, and all of the affiliated garbage that happens in bank robberies. Sometimes you have to take there's lots of legal stuff that is connected to the armed robbery paradigm, right? So that's my criminal record. So, as a person who's practiced restorative justice and sat in places listening to victims, and I have a genuine sensitivity and a remorse for the things I've done, you have to be careful about how you talk to the public. And so I think if John Howard had anything to do with facilitating a media, let's just talk plainly, a media strategy, it would be that we would also need to kind of train prisoners and even released prisoners in effective ways of communicating their own story. And I'm not talking about canning or coaching. I'm just talking about um, proper manners at the dinner table type stuff, right? Little things that, because as I don't want to hurt anybody, I don't ever want to hurt anybody again. I just came from a place where, there's 235 prisoners, and many of them said, I'm 100% convinced that they don't want to hurt anybody. So they don't want to hurt anybody with what they say, what they do, what's written about them. At the same time, they do need to be able to speak freely. So maybe John Howard can play a role in helping prisoners to be able to have their own kind of media strategy. That sounds a little bit too hokey for me, but how to talk to the public using bigger venues like this.
Yeah. Or even just presenting their stories in a way that doesn't
Yes.
dwell on the sensationalism, but dwells
Yeah.
on the progress that's being made and the contribution that they're making. I think that would be good.
I have the tremendous privilege um, of working with John Howard, of working with UBC Law, of working with restorative justice people in the past. I'm also part of a faith community that gives education on public speaking. So, I wasn't sitting in my room playing video games and hiding under the bed for 30 years. I was trying to make myself into a better person. And dang, if something didn't improve, my grandkids like me. What else can we talk about here? So some more of the
What
report.
did I miss, Iridian, in the first 20 minutes?
It's
Oh,
Mary
good
Cam.
morning, Catherine. Or good morning,
Yeah,
and
Catherine,
hello.
Mary, whatever. Mary,
Yeah,
Catherine.
yeah. And good morning to
Sorry, I'm
you.
late.
It has been a long time since we've seen each other,
I know.
and
Yeah,
it's so nice to see you this morning.
you look good.
And thank you.
Um, what you missed, Mary, was basically the first recommendation in Iridian's report, which has to do with how the Norwegian system seems to embrace bringing in the media and getting, allowing prisoners to talk about what they're doing, and they're not afraid of showing the positive things that are happening behind bars. And Iridian thinks that that would help. And then we talked a little bit more about media strategies, given that the media tends to focus on the offense a little bit more than I would like, But yes, good. You want to go
Yeah.
on to the second
Yeah,
recommendation again?
absolutely. So where Norway and Canada have some tremendous similarities is that we both have really strong social systems that are well funded by Norway's not a federation. It's I don't know, it's a royalty or something like that. It's a constitutional monarchy. But anyway, whatever it is that they have set up there, it's not cantons like Switzerland, but it's something kind of similar. They're just one thing. So they don't have as strong a disconnect in service providers as we do in Canada. Now, the kind of disconnect I'm talking about is not specific to the correctional system or even the federal correctional system. I turn on the news, I see the exact same thing happening in healthcare and all kinds of linkages where federal funding and federal direction provides empowerment to provincial service providers. So that's happening. Canada, a federal correctional system seems pretty well suited to facilitate a federal criminal code. Works well, but the problem is that guys don't reintegrate federally. When I got out, 9 days ago, 10 days ago, 7 days ago, I had to transfer my healthcare needs from the federal healthcare services provider, which was CSC, and I had to go over to the provincial. So I had to first go get a health card, which was, we'll talk about that in a second. Then I had to go to a stand-in clinic. What do we call that? A walk-in clinic, something. I was on a sidewalk for a bit. And then I had to get a prescription, and get that to a pharmacy. All those kind of things had to happen. And I was wondering as I was going through them why they couldn't have been facilitated from inside the institution. And I had a really, really good parole officer, 15 years experienced, very keen, focused, hard worker. But there's just a breakdown between our federal correctional system and our provincial aftercare providers. Now, I'm going to tell you the bad news. I spoke with a parole officer last Friday who's been 32 years in CSC and worked in the community as a parole officer for 25 years now. And he told me that in 2005, he was making the exact same complaint to whatever managers or sort of facilitators. So Canada has a tough time in getting the trains to run on time in terms of getting guys back into the community, whereas Norway doesn't as much. That might have to do with the structure of their government, but I got to believe that we can still do better. All this technology, I'm talking to people in Ottawa and Nova Scotia this morning, and how can this not happen, right? So Norway does much better at that. They also there's a concept in Norway that I don't hear it resonating in the media in Canada, and that is that aftercare is a super important part of the correctional process. It's almost as if Norway, which is a 1,200-year-old society, versus Canada at 167 years, it's almost like they have a more grown-up perspective, and that's not condescending Canadians in any way, but a more mature perspective on the fact that people who have been sent to prison for punishment, they've been removed from the community, are going to return to the community. In Norway, they have no life sentence. They sort of cap out at 21 or 25. I'm a bit foggy on that number this morning, but they have a cap number. And so they're coming back. And when they come back in, they're going to need the same services and care that everybody else who's a Norwegian is going to need, from healthcare to education to employment to housing. And isn't it interesting that those are all the factors that are being really promoted by the Canadian government on the federal framework for reintegration, right? Reducing recidivism. I synonymize the two, reintegration and reducing recidivism, because it always seems to me that if you have a good neighbor, they're probably not breaking into your house. So If you can get them to be good neighbors, then that just automatically reduces recidivism by, it's just like quitting smoking. Somehow it does something to make your lungs better.
Um, Iridian, can you talk a
Yes,
little bit about the import model and whether
absolutely.
or not, engaging service providers who provide those kind of services more broadly to be the providers in the prison rather than the correctional authorities, whether or not that you think makes any difference in terms of prepping people for release?
Again, Catherine, you asked me to make a comparison, right? So, I looked at, so for those who haven't yet read the report or not familiar with Norway's phraseology, they've got a thing that they call the import model, which is this came out in about 2008 with a special white paper from the government where they were kind of recalibrating their correctional system and how they would use a correctional system in the 21st century. The two ideas that they came up with that were their sort of two pillars are, one was normalization, which is a fancy word for making the prison system, making incarceration more normal. I guess it's not that fancy a word, is it? Normalization. So that's their big thing. The idea is if you don't institutionalize a guy, then you won't have to work so hard on deinstitutionalizing him on the back end. It's a good way to make the trains run on time again. But they also came up with this idea, which doesn't seem particularly um, different than what Canada does, in the import model. So they sit down and they say, okay, our services are going to be provided to these guys in the community. So why don't we bring the community into the prison to get them to start to provide the services in the prison? So all the education folks are contracted, usually locally to where the prisons are. All the healthcare providers, nurses, doctors, and so forth, are the exact same ones that they're going to use in the community. Um, Chaplaincy, library services, education services, big universities and colleges, all the profs come in so that they're bringing the community into the prison. And I thought, does Canada do something similar? Because I'm just in one institution right now where the school services are provided by an outside contractor, which is from the local school district. So we have a little bit of that, but Norway seems to really put it's on their agenda. They've created a buzzword for it, the import model. And the idea is that you can socialize the antisocial on the inside of the fence. I guess I'm not on that side of the fence right now, right? So on the inside of the fence. It's an interesting concept. I was unable to find any data on how it reduced recidivism, but common sense, if you want people to go out and act nice amongst the neighbors, why don't you bring the neighbors into a controllable setting where they can start to build relationships? And relationships is one of the 5 factors of the federal framework, positive relationships, right? So it seems like a very good idea, just pragmatically, and looking forward to seeing how, if I can find more data as we move forward on doing that. Now, here's where it works in with us, John Howard Society. Because, and with the greatest respect for those who have paid my rent, Correctional Services of Canada, for the last 30 years and provided my food and health care, I would make the following observation, and I do make it in the report. CSC is a very proud organization. It's a very staid organization. It is, I'm going to use the words of some of my Indigenous fellow prisoners, is probably the most colonialist organization left in the Canadian portfolio of service providers. It's a very military kind of arrangement, lots of this and that, and uniforms and little epaulets on their arms and so forth. They've got a big picture of the monarch hanging on the wall in the warden's office. So asking CSC to make even incremental changes, the correctional investigator has already expressed and continues to express his frustration with that. It's that it's a big organization that's very deeply entrenched in the way that it does business. it seems to, since about 2012, have become more, correctional investigators' words, more militant on the inside. Officers look less like social workers and more like the guys who come at you in a riot. So asking them to invite people into the institutions, John Howard Society across Canada knows that that sometimes gets to be very difficult. So I wanted to look at what could we do rather than reinventing the wheel, which the poor correctional investigator gets a heart attack every year when he has to write his report. It's just undoable. I thought, what if we could work with, rather than trying to get CSC to change, what if we got the public service providers to change? What if we could get the public service providers who have a lot of momentum and a big budget and a lot of energy? What if we could get them to come and sort of work their way up the pipe, the reintegration pipe, and make connection with the institutions? And like any changes, you have to make them small, especially a big organization in a country like Canada with a long established correctional system. So we found an organization that was doing the similar kind of work. They're a for-profit, they're a business organization, but they're doing a similar kind of work in assisting homeless people to reintegrate or to integrate into communities across Canada. They're using technology and large databases, and to a certain extent, they're using AI. And they're called Help Seeker. And we've been in contact with their senior management, their CEO. We had a meeting with Catherine and their CEO, and we talked to them about working with them and creating an app so that guys coming out of prison, what are guys coming out of prison? They're not homeless. They're worse than homeless. They're communityless, which has many connective elements with being homeless. And so if we could access the Help Seeker database, but put on top of it our own app, and we've started to do some app development, working with a former prisoner who's successfully reintegrated into the community. The buzzword is, I want to make good choices swipe and tap easy. I want to go into competition with Dial-A-Dope. I want to make it so that it's so easy for prisoners to swipe and tap a good choice that it will actually be easier for them to do than to swipe and tap a bad choice. And that's all it is, right? When you put, guys are coming out of prison, most of them are pretty well required to have a cell phone. I mean, the nudge, nudge, wink, wink is really strong. In one halfway house, the parole officer said to the fella, listen, I need to hear from you every hour, or I need to have a 1 hour visual on you. As soon as you got a cell phone, she's like, okay, that can go to 4 hour visuals. So there's a pretty strong incentive to have a cell phone. Everybody's got a cell phone now. And if we could make an app that when they go on their cell phone, they have the John Howard app there, kind of our working title is HOME, which is an acronym for health and don't ask me the acronym. I got too many acronyms in my head today. But doing that kind of work, we would be able to use technology to very cost effectively harness the power of all the service providers in Canada and make it location specific for the offender. I got to get rid of that word, for the prisoner, the person, the guy on parole. Let's make up a new word here. The dude. Make it easier for him to swipe and tap a good choice, whether that good choice is online healthcare, online psychological services, a real person on the other end of the phone if they're in crisis, their parole officer. Why can't we be in competition with the gambling websites and the porn websites and the Dial-A-Dope websites? And, the government's got Dial-A-Dope websites now. Can you believe that? I've been in a cage for a while. It's kind of a funny place to live. Canada, not the cage. So that's what we're working on. We've made some, one other thing that I thought was kind of interesting, and I'm working with Catherine on this. I'm learning as I go because I'm a little bit naive on how funding rolls out through the federal government to NGOs and service providers, remembering the concept that when the guy comes from federal prison into a halfway house, he's no longer reintegrating federally, he's reintegrating municipally and provincially. And those are all the service providers.
Yeah.
So, and we play a big role in that. You know, the NGOs and the charities, we are the facilitators. You know, I was being a little bit tongue in cheek with my wording when I wrote, I said, we get do done, right? Which is what, you know, NGOs do in Canada. We've got jurisdictional service providers, municipal, provincial. How do we get the bridges in? Sometimes the bridges are out. Charities and NGOs, they do that in everything, healthcare, mental health, corrections, all kinds of places. So I was questioning whether there shouldn't be better funding, which, you know, my ED loved that. So how do we better fund those? Because the material that was coming out of the Senate report from last year on the rights of incarcerated and reintegrating people, there were a number of witnesses who testified before Senator Pate and the other senators saying, you know what, we're scrambling as hard as we can to get funding and help these guys coming out. We don't have enough halfway houses. We don't have enough workers. Even parole officers or their representatives from their union testified before the Senate and said, we don't have the time to do our caseloads effectively. So that seems like a really systemic flaw in our reintegration system. So I had asked the readers to maybe take a look at more direct funding or more funding directly from public safety to the NGOs. We need more halfway houses. We need more John Howard halfway houses. We need one of the things that Catherine and I are looking at, and Mary has sent us some material on, has come out recently, is home placements. That's a really underutilized aspect of the reintegration process. And there are people who want to do it. There are guys who would benefit massively. How about a guy coming out of jail after 30 years? I'm sitting in my home with my wife today, and I have a parole conditions that only require me to be back in the halfway house from currently this week, 9:30 at night until 7 in the morning. Next week, it's going to go 11 o'clock at night till 6 in the morning. So we call the halfway house the office. And my granddaughter says, you sleep in the office? Yeah, that's what we're doing this week. But for the rest of the time, I'm here making soup with my wife. It's a very calm environment. And other prisoners coming out who don't have a family circumstance like I have could go to a home placement and be put into a family circumstance where they could start to build family relationships. And there's some super, super positive people in Canada who have opened up their homes for prisoners, both provincial and federal, to come in as part of the reintegration process. I think all of that really needs to be looked at, and it can all be categorized under we need better funding for NGOs and charities that are doing the work. And the second aspect is we've asked Public Safety Canada to fund us on a pilot project here in British Columbia to use technology, but not just technology, but to use technology as a tool along with the work we're already doing to really supercharge the relationship between federal corrections and provincial reintegration and aftercare, right?
Now, I think the needs are great for people coming out of prisons. I know that the John Howard societies across the country do a great job, but there's more people coming out, and they're in locations often where we're not. And the extent that we can provide some kind of help or supplement the existing capacity, I think would be really good. And it needs that, you've heard me on this before, Renee, you need that human to human contact. I mean, you need to know that somebody is out there saying, we believe you can do it. I've never met a prisoner coming out of a prison who wasn't pretty committed to staying out, right?
Right.
But then life happens, right? Unemployment, a bad relationship, homelessness episode. These are not good, and they can send people into a tailspin if they're not adequately supported through these episodes. Yeah.
Catherine, I straight up, I don't know how they do it. Just to give my life is transparent. My wife is a very transparent person. We're happy to work with John Howard and anybody who believes in this. And I don't believe that's me. No, there
No,
we
that
go.
was me.
That's the coach. So I don't know how people do it. I'll just give you my last 8 days in a quick synopsis. I come out on day one, and my family's there to meet me. I mean, we're going through COVID, so it's been 3 years. I meet my grandson, who's 2 years old and is a COVID baby. It's the first time I've ever touched him in my life. So we're having the Waltons in the parking lot of Matsqui Institution. Wow. So imagine how overwhelming the body's going to do what the body's going to do. I like to consider myself a pretty level guy, and that I have a pretty strong control mechanism for, not weeping on demand. But the body's going to do what the body does. So I'm hyperventilating in the parking lot. I come out, we go to the halfway house. Things were moving very quickly. The parole officer who had been assigned to my case was sick that day. So we were instructed to wait there at the halfway house for a parole officer to come. Two new parole officers came. As they were coming up the stairs, literally 40 seconds before we met each other, the one assigned me to the other one's caseload, so he had not read anything. All that happens. Thankfully, he's a 25-year experienced, probably, man, did I win the lottery? The most experienced parole officer in my region, and I knew him for 30 years. He used to be a CX1 in the institution where I was. So it was kind of old home week for him and I. We sat together as a family. We talked about quickly what the expectations were, what the board was expecting from me. All that happened. And then he was like, okay, just make sure you're back by, I don't know, 5 o'clock or something. Well, I was just living in my bathroom 8 hours ago. What do you mean wait back till you're back by 5 o'clock? So I'm going, you mean I can like go outside? And he's like, yeah, there's an outside. Go ahead. So all that's happening. And then he also laid out to me what I needed to do in order to transfer over from federal to provincial healthcare. And this is one of our big beefs at John Howard Society. We're enjoined to some litigation on that there would be a change to the Canadian Healthcare Act so that we don't have to go through that nonsense. But now I have to make that transfer, and he's asking me straight up. He said, "Listen, they they're all over me at the office about this one. Could you make this a priority?" So now I have a family with a vehicle. My family lives in the community that I have never been in before, but they live there. She knows where to go, what to do. We go down, we get the picture taken. I have a little bit of resources. And I thought to myself, what about a prisoner who comes out who has $80 in his pocket,
Yeah.
no family, doesn't know the community at all where he is. He's got to catch a bus somewhere, doesn't have a telephone. How does that guy get his health care card?
Right.
And I've talked to other prisoners since I've been out as part of what I do with John Howard and trying to stay up to date and contemporary on what's going on. They've been in halfway houses, some of them for 6 and 8 weeks. They haven't been down and got their health care card yet. So no wonder the supervisor of the parole office is losing her mind. So that happens for me. Then I got to go to a walk-in clinic. Never been to a walk-in clinic before. Wouldn't know where one is. What if the guy didn't have a phone and couldn't Google? All of these are real things. So I said to the halfway house folks where I am, I said, I don't know how anybody does it without a family and a support team and so forth. And the girl said, well, everybody has their processes. And I'm thinking, what process? Like you would stand out in the parking lot and go, wow, a tree. And go up and hug the tree. I haven't seen a tree in a while, right? So I think there's a real gap there. And John Howard has a lot of experience we were the first ones to sort of crack ground on, not the first ones, I could be out wrong about, there's St. Leonard Society and 7 Steps at Alberta, but we were right up at the front edge of putting halfway houses into the ground and welcoming guys into the community into that process. I think for the 21st century, um, the CI and everybody has acknowledged for some reason corrections is just like no technology. I mean, I could show you. I came out with floppy disks Okay. I went to my parole meeting with the parole officer, and I had my address book there. He was looking at it. He says, "What's that?" I said, "It's an address book." He looked at me like, "Where have you been, Fred Flintstone?" So, because everybody touches their phone and they know everything. I didn't even know how to turn the phone on. Now, granted, I am an outlier a bit in terms of the fact that I've been in for longer than many, but the CI and Canadian Human Rights put out a report on death and dying, or aging and dying in prison, or something. That number of men coming out who've been incarcerated for a long time and who are not up to date on technology, that's a growing proportion of the corrections profile. So I'm not as outlier as many people might think. I'm going to move on to the last portion because we're running out of time, and it's so nice to visit with Mary and Catherine this morning. My word, I wish I could bundle them up and put them in the Pan Pacific, and we could just all go to the, I don't know, restaurant or something. But the last feature that I looked at was, I thought, what could we do? Because you can sit around, and I mean, I've read every CI report for the last 32 years. You can sit around and show what's wrong and make a recommendation according to policy. And poor Ivan and Howard, they've been doing that faithfully and diligently for decades, it seems, and they're not making any progress. I sort of tap into Einstein's school of thought that if you do the same thing over and over again and expect something different, that's insanity. So what could we do? Maybe we can implement technology. I think that there's a place in there for us. There's a strong lane for John Howard in there. The other one that I recommended was, how come, here's the $64,000 question. Why are the minimum security institutions operating at less than 50% capacity for their bed space at the same time that we are releasing 65% of federal prisoners to the community on statutory release with no integration time? I mean, there's not enough bed space in any of the halfway houses across Canada for all these guys that are coming out with stat release condition to be at a CRF. It just seems like a really systemic underutilization. Wow, now I'm starting to talk like I hang around with Michael Jackson too much. But it seems like a bad idea. How's that? And that is, why are we not getting guys, almost, if not by law, we could just utilize policy or even ad hoc policy. Why are we not getting guys to minimum security at least 6 months in advance of their release dates? That makes no sense. In my experience, I came into federal corrections in 1990. Minimum security was always carrot and stick. If you're a good boy inside the penitentiary, you get to go down to minimum security. They called it cascading. And even when we brought in the CCRA, and even when we started to realize, who was it now? It wasn't Ann Kelly. It was the first
Von Heck?
female
Oh, Lucy.
commissioner. Yeah, Lucy.
Lucy.
I think Lucy brought in the word reintegration. And everybody's like, reintegration? What the heck's that? It means getting out of prison. Okay, good. So she implemented it. And she pushed that hard to get that into the lexicon for CSC, because nobody had really, we all thought it was a pretty clunky word. Now it's the word we all use. So, but even when that kind of reintegration agenda came in under Lucy, we still use the minimum securities at carrot and stick. We got guys sitting there for 10 years on life parole, or not on life parole. They're lifers. They haven't gotten out on parole. They're going out on ETAs for 10 years. And I don't know what their dynamic is, or, each case is different, but we could use the minimum securities in Canada much better for reintegration. And maybe that would be a place to also introduce technology, and cross our fingers, maybe CSC would say, you know what, we're okay with using technology at minimum security. They're definitely not into using it at medium security, and believe me, you don't want to even start that one. But maybe, we put it to them, we develop our app, we start using it with guys in CRFs, and then we show it to the folks that are in minimum security. They talk to their tech people, they talk to their security people, and we get the idea in their brain that we need to start training guys on how to use the app in minimum security under supervision. Maybe that's a way to do our own kind of import model. Rather than physically importing people into the sites, maybe we could digitally import the folks into the sites and the services, right? And I think that's a doable thing. And it's very cost effective, extremely cost effective. I'm sure the government loves that story. And I think JHS is absolutely the organization to lead on this because of our reputation in criminal justice.
I think when we get the statistical analysis, we'll find that, where we're going to see higher recidivism rates are among people who've been released at stat release and at warrant expiry. Warrant expiry to me is even worse in terms of a failure to provide any kind of continuity into the community. They've designated these people as high risk to reoffend, and they just let them out the back door at the very last minute and, wait for the police to pick them up again. Like, it's not even close to being any kind of a reintegration strategy. But I think there's lots that we can do. Iridian's report is called Feeding the Beast.
No, feeding time, not feeding the beast.
Missed it by this much. Okay.
Yeah. And you know what? I tried to dress up for you today so you wouldn't think, wow, we have to feed the beast, feed the monkey, whatever. Feeding time. So the play on words on feeding time is the old sort of indigenous saw. It may not be as indigenous as we think it is, and that is when you have the white dog and the black dog fighting inside your chest, which one wins? It's the one you feed, right? So that's the play. It's now the background on that is that Canadians now have to decide. I don't think we need more policy. I don't think we need more law in any way. I think Canadians now have to decide which of those two natures they're going to feed inside of themselves, whether they're going to tip to the better angels of their personal nature. I think we can do something in providing, one, better access to prisoners through some sort of a media strategy. Secondly, I think that the federal government needs to do better funding on reintegration strategies and to work with the NGOs and the charities and even the service providers, healthcare, so forth. The third one is we're going to try our very best. We're seeking funding right now to do a pilot project in the Pacific region to build and develop an app and then to track that and see its direct relation to reducing recidivism. And then we've strongly encouraged CSC to review its thinking on better use of the minimum securities, not so much as giving a carrot to a prisoner, but as using them specifically for the reintegration process. Guys need to be there because the numbers are clear, just like Catherine said. The numbers for recidivism are almost through the roof comparatively when you look at guys coming out on stat release and warrant expiry versus guys that are going to CRFs and having a reintegration process. Feed the beast.
Mary, the part at the beginning that you might have missed is that Iridian felt that Norway had copied the legislative framework from Canada based on the correctional law review, that all of the elements that we need to be effective are already there. It's really a question of operationalizing them and putting them into practice. Being one of the authors of the CCRA, I don't know how you feel about that, but it's stood the test of, 30 years now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you so much, Iridian. It's been great. We're going to post the report. I'm not even going to mention its name, but it's a good one, and we will carry on. But I don't think we've seen the last of you, Iridian. Hang in there.
Thank you very much. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate you being here.
Bye-bye, Mary.
Take care.
Thank you.